Hello, I am Vinay. I am almost 8 and my favorite hobby is playing basketball. My favorite sport is, of course, basketball. Okay, looks like you guys are ready. Why don't you guys go get me one of the books from the shelf, the final book covers, and then I will set it up for you guys to begin writing on that. Okay, so you go get
Teachers in differentiated classrooms find themselves almost constantly in the act of assessing students. Assessment in their classroom takes on a very different role from that of assessment in other classrooms. In differentiated classrooms, assessment is ongoing, and it's both the beginning and the end, so to speak. All too often, in more traditional settings, assessment is only the end point. It tells us what students have learned over a period of time, and after it, most often we move on to the next unit of study or the next lesson. In a differentiated classroom, assessment occurs before a unit even begins. It tells us what students need to do during that unit. It helps us to make changes during the course of the unit. And it tells us what we need to continue working on once the unit has ended. What this means, of course, is that teachers should always be assessing their students' progress in both formal and informal ways.
In order to assess students in the classroom, I have to take copious notes. I'm doing observations on a daily basis, looking at work on a daily and a weekly basis. I'm watching the students as they make choices in the classroom, as they work through any work that I might assign them. We do discussions before we start units to see what they already know and where they may want to go with whatever unit of study we're going to take on. And I write all those things down and I reflect on my notes over and over and over again in order to figure out what's going to be best for the given student and the given class and the small groups.
But more important than the assessment itself is the actual use of the information we learn from it. A KWL chart completed at the start of a unit on plants, showing what students already know about plants and what they want to learn about them, is of very little use if we don't use that information to modify the plant unit. But often teachers give pre-assessments without then taking the time to analyze the results and use the results as a basis for planning. When they pre-assess students, teachers are often surprised to find that their students know much more about topics and skills than they might have predicted. Knowing this ahead of time can give us valuable time in a classroom by allowing students to move more quickly through information and skills that they already know. Because teachers in differentiated classrooms base their instruction on differing readiness levels, learning profiles, and interests, they also assess students in these areas. Where are students' understandings and skills with regard to the topic of study? What background knowledge do the students have? How might they learn the material most quickly and most effectively? And what would they like to learn more about within this topic of study? While some teachers like to give broad pre-assessments at the beginning of the school year that provide information about students' likes and dislikes, these types of assessments, while helpful in getting to know students, do little to inform our instruction. For instance, knowing students' favorite books and movies really doesn't tell me what they would be interested in studying in depth during a unit on weather. It's best to pre-assess for individual units. In an upper elementary, middle school, or high school classroom, it can be fairly easy to find out how students learn best or what they'd like to study simply by asking them. Older students have spent enough time in classrooms to know what they like and what they don't like, what they're good at, and what they struggle with. So before a unit on weather, we might, for example, ask students to rank themselves with regard to interest in weather and interest in science in general, in addition to ability to carry out experiments, ability to work independently, and an ability to follow directions, all skills that students need in science classrooms. And there's certainly many other pieces of information that would help us design an effective unit on weather for our students. For instance, we might also want to incorporate some independent study or small group investigation during the unit, so knowing students' interests would be helpful. So who's interested in learning more about storms at sea, or storm tracking, or famous storms in history? Often, older students can tell us in writing about their strengths, their interests, and their preferred modes of learning, but discussions can give us a wealth of information too. The trick is to write that information down so that it's available for reflection and analysis later. Certainly, student learning profiles, or how students learn best, can vary widely in a classroom. Observing your students often can give you some valuable information about their learning profiles. Do some seem to prefer working alone, while others gravitate toward groups? Do some of your students need structured assignments, while others prefer open-ended ones? Certainly some students need to be able to move, while others can sit still for longer periods of time. Some students work well in noisy environments, while others need quiet. There are many theories about learning that can also inform our understanding of students' learning profiles. For instance, the learning styles approach tells us that some people are visual learners, needing to see information in order to take it in.
The umpire said I was safe at first base. Safe. SAFE.
Others are auditory learners who learn best by listening and hearing. And a third group is tactile, those who need to touch and physically manipulate information. Also, there's Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, which we'll discuss later. Because there's so much we need to know about our students, it's best to vary the kinds of assessments we use in order to get at different types of information. Some methods of assessment are more formal, while others are more informal, but in combination they can give us great insight into what students already know and understand, what they can do, what they want to learn more about, and how they learn best. Differentiated instruction does not ask us to throw away our grade books, but it does require some thought as to how we keep records of what we learn about students. For example, how do I design a record-keeping system that allows me to show that students are working on different activities? It may take some redesigning of the traditional gradebook, but it's certainly possible. Also, how do I keep track of the comments my students make during discussions and while they're working? For primary teachers, a main concern is assessing students who really can't tell you everything they know and understand on paper and pencil assessments. Primary teachers end up taking a lot of observational notes. There are many ways to make the assessment process more effective, whether you're teaching young children or older students. The first step in assessment is to make sure that all the assessments you plan to give really address your objectives. An assessment, whether it's a unit test or a journal entry, isn't going to tell you very much about what you need to know if it doesn't address the objectives you've identified as important. This sounds obvious, but we often skip this step and find ourselves with little valid information about what students have gained over the course of a unit. A helpful hint about pre-assessments: give them a week or two before a unit begins. This will give you a chance to use the information you learn as you design unit activities. If you give the pre-assessment the day before you plan to begin your unit, you may find yourself scrambling to make last-minute changes to your plans. Also, it helps to have a discussion or do an activity with students before giving a pre-assessment. This can jog students' memories about a topic and thus give you a more accurate picture of their prior knowledge about it. Spend time observing your students on a weekly basis. Perhaps it's during small group discussions or independent work times, but find ways to sit back and watch them. You'll be amazed by what you can learn when you really take the time to observe. Make sure that you take notes of your observations. Some teachers use sticky pads for note-taking. Others are never without a pad of paper on a clipboard. Whatever your method, use it often. Date your notes so that you can use them when you have parent conferences or when you're writing report cards. You'll be glad you have them. Also, take time to conference with your students. That focused time not only provides feedback to them and you, but also gives you an opportunity to share with them what you're observing about their learning. It tells them that you know and respect them as learners. Finally, keep in mind that everything students do and say can be assessment information if we use it to guide our teaching. Your assignment before your next discussion is to create some pre-assessments based on your curriculum. Try creating them for different subject areas, grade levels, or topics. Be sure that your assessments tell you something about readiness, learning profile, and interest. Also, make sure to look closely at your objectives as you design your pre-assessments to ensure that the two match up.